The Master of Hestviken by Sigrid Undset. Translated from the Norwegian by Arthur G. Chater. Book 3. In the Wilderness. Part 2. The Wilderness. Chapter 1. Early in the spring, the year after Olav Audunsson's foreign voyage, a thing was held at Haugvik one morning, and Eirik was allowed to attend it with his father. But as they were going home, it fell out that the Ringel folk went in Olaf's boat, and Eirik was to follow in another craft. Not till late in the afternoon did he come, in a sailing boat that was laden to the water's edge with half-grown lads. Ragnar came in to her master and said that as many of the boys came from far up the parish, they might well want food and drink before setting out inland. "Yes," said Olaf. The lads made their way indoors, and Olaf replied to their greetings with a nod. Then he went out, for he felt disturbed by all these strange children who hung about the benches looking ill at ease. He was standing by the stable door when the band of youths came out again, but they did not seem to think there was any hurry about leaving. They stayed about the yard, nosing here and there among the houses, 2 or 3 together, prying and looking about them. Others kept together in a bunch, chattering and laughing and bickering in a mild way, but it was all play and good humour. Olaf stayed where he was, for he had no desire to mix with this throng. It was cold, now the sun was down, and the sharp young voices carried far in the still spring evening. Snow was still lying under the north walls of the houses, and presently the lads took to snowballing. Olaf paid no great attention to them, but there was one who showed up among the other lads. He was the tallest of the company and handsome in a way, red and white like milk and blood, with long, smooth, straw-coloured hair. Eirik kept close to this lad and helped him. But after a while Olaf saw that all the other boys had joined in to attacking Eirik. They belaboured him with snowballs and barred his way to the drift, so that he had none to throw back. The tall lad stood looking on. Then Eirik made a dash between the byres. The hollow behind the outhouses was still full of snow. Eirik jumped into it and began making snowballs, which he hurled at the crowd of his pursuers. And now Olaf stepped behind the outhouses to see what would happen. Eirik shook off the first enemies who leapt down upon him, plunging through the crust so that he sank to the middle in the wet snow. He pulled himself out of the hollow and onto a ledge of the rock behind. From there he sent fistful after fistful of turf and loose stones at the heads of his assailants, who replied with snowballs. There was a great shouting at this. Evidently the game was about to take an angry turn. A snowball caught Eirik in the eye, making him duck and put up his hand. At that moment the tall, fair boy, who had stood aloof, jumped up and threw his arms around Eirik. He flung him head foremost into the snowdrift, and all the other boys threw themselves upon him and ducked him in the filthy snow, yelling and laughing the while, as Eirik howled with rage, half stifled under the heap. Olaf came a few steps nearer. The tall, fair boy caught sight of him and said something to the others. They got up at once. Eirik got onto his feet. He was bleeding at the mouth, and he turned to the tall boy, shrieking frantically. "A dirty clown you are! Call yourself a man! I helped you!" He was crying with rage. Olaf noticed that the tall, fair boy looked strangely foolish now, as he blinked and turned away from Eirik's father. But all the other lads made haste to get out of the hollow. Olaf followed slowly. On reaching the yard, he saw the whole band of them up by the barn, making for the east. They had neither taken leave nor thanked him for his hospitality. Eirik stood just behind his father. He was still panting as he pressed a snowball, now against his swollen eye, now to his bleeding lip. "Who was he, that fair lad?" asked Olav. "Jorund Reaper." Eirik snuffled and swallowed. He was staring at the band as they disappeared in the darkness toward Kvøndal. "Jorund? Has anyone got that name hereabouts?" Eirik replied that Jorund came from a great farm to the eastward, by Icelander, but he had an aunt who was married at Jonas and kinsfolk at Randaberg. He was often there. Olav shook his head unconcernedly. He knew little of these folk, and had never spoken with them. After supper the men sat in the hall. They had brought in some saddlery and implements to put in order for the spring work of the farm. Once, on waking from his own thoughts, Olav heard his housecarls laughing and sneering, while Eirik poured out an impetuous tale. "When they came and set on me all at the same time, what could I do? Do you think I could not have thrown every single one of them, if we had met on level ground?" "Ah, yeah, surely, you would have done that." "And I kept them off me a long time." "Ah, but then you had such help from that brave foster-brother of yours, Eirik," laughed one of the men. Eirik was instantly silenced. Olav saw that the boy's lips quivered. He was pressing back the tears and trying to look unconcerned. Olav felt with latent anger that there was something wrong in this. That the housecarls dared to taunt and slight the son of the house while his father was there. Eirik was no longer a little boy. So he put down what he had in his hands, stretched himself and yawned. "All right, men, it's already late. Time to go to rest." When father and son were left alone in the hall, Olav came and stood before Eirik. The lad sat on the bench, weeping quietly. "You must have done with this now, Eirik, this foolish boasting. When you do it, the serving folk think they can make a fool of you." As the boy made no answer, but simply sat there, struggling with his tears, Olav went on, rather more harshly. "And you ought to be ashamed to cry because you got a beating." Eirik snuffled once or twice. "I am not crying because I got a beating." "What are you crying for, then?" "Jorund," Eirik swallowed. "We had promised each other loyal fellowship for life. We took the oath of blood brotherhood last autumn." "What nonsense is this?" asked his father rather scornfully. Eirik explained with sudden eagerness. They had met at church one Sunday in the autumn, and then Eirik had spoken of something he had heard lately, that it was a custom in old days for friends to bind themselves by an oath of blood brotherhood. Jorund was willing, but every time they got so far as lifting the strip of turf on the points of their spears, it broke to pieces, and at last Jorund lost patience. Then Sira Halbjorn came out, and he was very angry when he saw all the holes that had been dug in his calf paddock. Olaf shook his head in despair. What folly! Eirik was standing with one foot on the hearth, close to the glowing embers, and a cloud of steam came from his shoe. The boy looked so melancholy with his tall, weedy body, his long neck, and the dark curly head bent down. Everything about Eirik was young and slight. Olaf had a sudden desire to show the boy a kindness. "Don't scorch your shoe. It will be as hard as a board tomorrow." Olaf handed him a pair of his own shoes. "You may have the loan of these tomorrow. Stuff straw into yours so that they may dry slowly." Eirik thanked him cheerfully, and Olaf began to pull off his clothes. Presently the boy cried out with a laugh, "Father, I have outgrown your shoes now. Look at this." It was true. Ah, yes, his own feet were unusually small, and Eirik looked like being large-limbed. Olaf lay long awake. The thought of Eirik galled and troubled him. In these last years, ever since his relations with Torhild Bjornsdatter took that unfortunate turn, he had shunned the boy, almost without premeditation. Eirik was there, but the less he thought of it, the better. But this last winter it had seemed as if Eirik sought to thrust himself upon his father's attention. At first Olaf believed this was the result of the lad having run loose a whole summer without any man's hand over him. Now he must quickly find some means of quelling these loud-voiced ways that the boy had got into. But Olaf was startled to see, with great surprise and little joy, that he was no longer able to relegate Eirik to that outer sphere of his father's life, to which the lad had so long been banished. It was clear that he would have to devote more care to the boy's training, cordially as he disliked the thought. He saw all the lad's faults and failings, and things could not go on as now, when their inferiors showed openly that they too saw them. Eirik had now reached an age when it was only seemly that he should mix with other men in his father's company, but then Olaf would have to see that the lad was shown the respect due to their position. But Eirik himself had little sense of how to behave himself. At home he mixed with the servants of the house. One day he was their familiar, childish and fatuous. The next he put on a proud and lofty air. But the folk only made fun of this before the boy's very eyes. The worst thing, however, was that he haunted Rundmere early and late. The place had become a vile den since Liv and Arnketil had gone there. Egil and Vilgard, his younger brother, were also housed there now, and they brought in others of the like sort. It came to Olaf's ears that Eirik had actually joined in dicing with the folk who came in from the highways, all kinds of vagabonds, both men and women. He took the lad to task for it, chiding him sharply. Then, to Olaf's unspeakable surprise, Eirik turned insolent and answered back. Olaf simply took hold of the boy's neck, forced his head down, and flung him aside. But he liked doing it no better, as he felt how weakly and, as it were, disjointedly, the lad collapsed under his hand. And the expression of Eirik's eyes, at once cowed and malicious, aroused violent repugnance in Olaf, though at the same time he felt pity for the weakling. There was another matter which troubled Olaf tonight. He had guessed well enough what Una had in her mind when she came down to the boats on leaving the Thing and asked him to take her with him. And he had been right. When they came ashore, she had contrived to be alone with him by the boathouses. Then she told him in plain words. There were now other suitors for Disa Erlendsdatter, but both she and Torgrim would rather that Olaf won the bride. Olaf thought he had given no very definite reply, but now he could no longer avoid making them a plain answer, and doubtless it would lead to some cooling of friendship between him and his kinsfolk when he showed so little appreciation. He saw clearly enough how kindly they had meant it when they as good as offered him Torgrim's rich cousin in marriage, and assuredly the whole neighbourhood had heard of the matter. He saw now that he ought to have let them know long ago that he did not wish to marry again. They had every right to complain that he had rewarded their loyal spirit of kinship with disdain. Since he had been a widower, there had been a revival of intercourse between him and his kinswomen, the daughter of Arn and their husbands. And now, too, he remarked that his neighbours seemed to smooth the way for him. Did he wish it, he could now come forward and resume the position which the Master of Hestviken ought to occupy in the district. Together with his kinsman by marriage at Skikjostad and Ringel, he could acquire both power and honour in the 100, and he liked both Torgrim and Bard. Indeed, Bard he liked better than most other men. It was the daughters of Arn and their husbands who stood in the background and induced people, those who had their boats and boathouses on his beach, to come forward and suggest that all the old questions that had been left undecided, as to the rights of the different estates, his share in the catches of fish and such matters, might just as well be settled now. There were many things that Olaf had let drift for years because he felt lonely and overburdened, and his neighbours and others who had been wont to take the lower road down to the creek, keeping away from the manor on the hill, now found occasion to visit his house and enjoyed such hospitality as had been shown in former days at Hestviken. Perhaps it was not unnatural. It had been reasonable enough that folks kept away from the house so long as its mistress lay there sick and disabled. But now Olaf was offered an opportunity of retrieving. Yes, he might just as well be frank about it. He could now recover all it had cost him to be Steinfinn Thorison's foster son and Ingunn's bridegroom. But he would not. Disa was rich, of good family. Her first marriage had added to her repute, and she had inherited Rolstad and its wealth from the two little sons who had been drowned a year or two before in the breaking up of the ice. Her age agreed with his, some 30 years, and as she was not a lady of surpassing beauty, she was far from ugly, a shapely, kind, healthy and cheerful woman. Never again would he be offered so good a match. If he did not grasp at her with both hands, it would be deemed by all that he did not desire his own welfare. And he liked the young widow, the little he had seen of her. But he would not marry Disa Erlendsdatter. It was not the same as when he refused Torhild. That he had done under compulsion, he knew not of what. From time to time desire came upon him when he thought of Torhild. He longed to embrace her great wholesome body as a man bleeding to death longs to quench his thirst. And he would be sick with impatience to place everything in her capable hands, when he himself had to wrestle with matters which properly came under the care of the mistress of the house. He had renounced her because he felt he must, whether he desired her for himself or not. But at the thought of Disa dwelling here at Hestviken, meeting him at his own door, of his having to listen to all that she said and answer her, no, then he knew he would not if she brought him all the gold there was in Norway. He shuddered with aversion at the thought of having her sleeping here between himself and the wall through the long sleepless nights. At such times he could not possibly bear to have an entirely strange woman close to him. Torhild, if she had been sleeping by his side now, he knew that whether asleep or awake, her loyal heart would be full of care for his welfare. He would not feel ashamed with her, were his mind never so restless. So it was. He often thought it hard that an instinct which he did not himself understand forbade him to fetch home the lowly Torhild and resume his concubinage with her. But his whole being rebelled, if he did but call to mind that his best and most faithful friends sought to have him married to the rich and virtuous widow of Svein of Rolstad. He remembered having once thought that in the end it might turn out that his life would shape itself after the manner of this happiness, when it began to dawn on him that Ingunn was not destined for a long life. At that time he had thrust such thoughts from him as infidelity. But then she was here, she was his wife, and behind every grey and evil day, and every fresh misfortune, every fresh drop of bitterness that fell into his cup, he had known that he would rather have the life he had with Ingunn than any other lot without her. But now she was gone, and it would cost him but a word to secure Rolstadt and wealth, a healthy and capable wife, heirs to all they might possess in common, a firm alliance with the kinsfolk whom he liked, a powerful position in the district. And then Olav felt that rather than have all this happiness, he would die. The brightness had passed from Ingunn's memory since that adventure in London. It was as though he could no longer keep her distinct from the other. All seemed blind, unthinking, bestially stupid. That she had frittered away the happiness of both, that he himself had strayed from every path he should have followed, till he now felt as though his own soul were nothing but a little grey, hardened stone. Since that night after the pilgrimage, all the thoughts he had struggled with seemed to have turned to stones. He remembered them, and knew them in a way, as the lad in the fairy tale recognised his friends in the pillar stones outside the giant's castle. But they left him dull and cold. He knew that in this new calm that had come upon him, he was a poorer man than before, when he lived in fear and pain. Beneath every stab of remorse and every longing for peace, there had been something which was much greater and stronger than his fear. He loved him from whom he fled, and even to the end he had secretly hoped that the hour would come when he could fly no more. Sooner or later, he must have thought, he would be reconciled to God, without its being left to him to choose. But he had been forced to choose, and choose again. And so long had he chosen himself that he had lost even his love of God. But at the same time, the fire and strength seemed to have gone out of his love for everything else he had held dear in this world. God, Jesus Christ, Mary. Once he had only to think upon these words for his heart to glow with fervour within him. Now it mattered nothing to him whether he said his prayers in church or at home, morning and evening, if others were by and it was the time, or whether he omitted to pray when alone. But this new indifference was as much poorer than his old torment, as a heap of ashes is poorer than a blazing fire. But Ingunn, were her memory never so faded and burnt out, he would not cast it out to make room for new possessions. And as his life was now, he would neither own nor bring into it this new happiness he was offered. Olav half-priest had once told him of Hvitserk's howe, the largest of the mounds here by the brow of the wood. It was before the Christian faith had come to the land. The race of Ingjald then possessed Hestviken, that stock of which his grandfather's grandmother had come, and the name of the chief was Jarl Hvitserk. He had been a famous Viking, but now he was in extreme old age. Then his enemies burnt his homestead of Hestviken. This was the first of the 3 burnings that had laid the manor in ashes. Jarl's sons cleared the site and had timber brought to build the houses anew. But Jarl let his housecarls cast up a barrow, and on the day they set about dragging off the charred beams of Jarl's hall, the old man went into the mound and bade his thralls close up the earthen house with stones. Olav Audunsson remembered that he had shaken his head when his old namesake told him this tale. But at the same time he had thought him a doughty fellow, that same old heathen. Now he lay in the darkness, smiling a little at his thought. He had taken good heed not to speak of it to any priest, but he offered a Yule cup to the spirit of the mound, and carried out a bowl of ale on the eve of other great festivals. Even Arnvid did so at his own home. It was no great sin, he said, if one did but go quietly about it, without asking anything of the dead in return. Now, maybe, he ought to be more mindful of his offerings. Like enough, he would meet with his heathen ancestor in the end.